Welcome to Romance Studies 202, Literature and Culture from Modernism to the Present. And today I'm very pleased indeed to be talking to Professor Emily Zobel-Marshall, who is Professor of Postcolonial Literature at Leeds Beckett in the UK in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Leeds Beckett. She's the author of a number of books, including Anansi's Journey, A Story of Jamaican Cultural Resistance, and American Trickster, Trauma, Tradition, and Brer Rabbit. But today we'll be talking about this book, Black Shakali, by Joseph Zobel, who is, in fact, or was in fact, also Professor Zobel-Marshall's grandfather. Emily, if I may, again, thank you for your time. And my first question is just, how would you approach this book?
Thank you, John, and it's lovely to be here. Well, for a number of years when I was a lecturer um, at undergraduate and MA level, I decided that because it was my grandfather who wrote Black Shakali or La Rue Cazenègre, I wouldn't get enough critical distance to be able to teach it. But after he passed, and after a number of years of teaching Bildungsromans, which were from the Caribbean, I realized that actually Black Shakali was really fitted into the course that I wanted to teach. And I felt that he had passed for long enough for me to be able to achieve that critical distance as an academic, but also as the granddaughter of Joseph. So the key things that I've always focused on in my lectures with my students have been the racial politics in Martinique. I've also looked at Martinique as a département outre-mer, as a DOM of France, so an overseas department of France, and what that means culturally and in terms of sort of post-colonial status. I'm very interested in the role of the storyteller. So the two books that you mentioned there, Anansi's Journey and the Brer Rabbit book, they are about the trickster figure in West Africa. And I think I was very much inspired by the figure of the storyteller, Monsieur Meduse, the griot, in La Rue Cazenègre, in Black Shakali. And so I spent some time looking at the figure of the storyteller and also focusing on the role of education, because Joseph was a huge believer in education as a key to freedom. There's actually a school in Martinique now, which was built in honor of him, and it says above the door that education is the key to freedom. So he really did feel that. But what I also talk about a bit is that how an education and a colonial education especially can move one away from their roots, and the extent to which that happened with Joseph. And I also just touch on theories of negritude and where Joseph sits within the negritude movement of the time.
There's a lot there. Thank you
There
so
is a
much.
lot there. Yeah.
I've just the notion of the département outre-mer. Of
Hmm.
course, Martinique was a French colony, and
Yes.
the at the time in which this is set, the book is set, it was still a colony. Then in the 1940s, it becomes legally integrated into France, so that officially Fort-de-France is as much French as Paris, for instance, or whatever.
That's right.
And Zobel's writing this after that. In 1950, it comes out. This book comes out. So after that
Yes.
departmentalization. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the griot figure, Monsieur Meduse, who is with whom the young child, the young Joseph in this book, has a particular affinity for the first half or so of the book.
Yes. So Monsieur Meadows is a key figure, and he really instills in José, the young José, his sense of Black consciousness, his understanding about his ancestors being from Africa, and how the conditions of enslavement have changed very little in colonial Martinique. So there's a passage in the book, and it's also in the film, where Monsieur Meadows says that his father told him that when he was when abolition took place, there he ran like all the other blacks in this country and celebrated his freedom only to realize that he was straight back in La Rue Cazeneuve in Black Shack Alley, and nothing had changed. Though the law forbade the whites from whipping them, but it didn't make them pay their due. And so that's a very sort of that resonates throughout the novel. Um, and but also José doesn't have a father figure, and that was the case for Joseph Zobel as well. He was raised by his grandmother, and his mother was a wet nurse for a white family. So Monsieur Meadows becomes a kind of father or grandfatherly figure, a guide, if you like. And he also has these incredible moments of call and response storytelling. Écric, écrac, émisticric, émisticrac, just to make sure that the young José is listening to his story. And I'm really interested in the way that novels from the African diaspora incorporate those oral storytelling traditions. So not just in a sense of incorporating proverbs and folklore and the figure of the storyteller, but how the way that the text is structured also calls for a reader response. So there's a call and response happening between the author and the reader. And in the end of the novel, there is a cry out saying, for people to engage, for those that have read the book, to open their eyes and not be blind to what they've just read.
Right. The translation that we've got at least here is it is to those who are blind and those who block their ears that I must shout it, the final line of the novel. I
That's
wonder,
right.
continuing on this notion of the griot and also picking up on something else you were talking about the role of education. It's like there's I mean, would you suggest would you agree that there's kind of two competing modes of education, one of which comes through Monsieur Medouz, it's oral, it's sort of this
Hmm.
interaction, this crack, as you say, in which Medouz is telling a sort of history from below, perhaps. Would
Mm,
that be fair? And
that's
then on
right.
the other hand, there's young José's passage through the
Mm,
official French educational system. I wonder if you could
yes.
talk about that tension.
Yes. Yeah, and there is a tension. So that absolutely, as you say, there is the education that he receives on Black Chacali and on La Rue Cazeneuve, and then his colonial French education, and it's the two worlds in the novel contrast greatly, as there's the rigidity and the formality of school, school is also a quite brutal and violent place. But he is a star student, and indeed, it takes him away from Black Shack Alley. He goes to Fort-de-France with Montine, and she actually washes clothes so that he can attend the lycée there. Um, and when he returns to Black Shack Alley, he realizes how poor it is. He sees it with fresh eyes. So the education is constantly sort of pulling him away from his roots and making him feel, othered or different from the place in which he lived. And actually, after Joseph ended up in 1946 going to Paris, Joseph Zobel left his family, his young children in Martinique, and went to Paris to make it as a writer. And interestingly, he never went back to live in Martinique. He lived in Senegal and in France. And although the novel is very much a celebration of Creole Martinican culture, um, Joseph Sobel didn't want his children to speak Creole in the family home. So it's interesting how this sort of insidious colonial pressure seeps in to his own world. Um, and it's very much as the sort of Salman Rushdie, talks about that idea of, being in a place of exile, and having to have an imaginary homeland, because the place that you imagine is forever changed when you move away from it, when you are educated out of it, when you see it with different eyes. And I think that there is some of that already in the book, and then it's sort of reflected and echoed throughout Joseph Sobel's life.
Yet the book also captures. I mean, so the book is both a narrative, as you say, of increasing distance
Mm,
from Black Shack Alley, from that place of origin, and a recognition perhaps that he can't return, or that he wouldn't return. If he returned, he has changed so much. Yeah, the
Mm,
book is also a sort of it memorializes. It's a memory of that upbringing as well, and how
absolutely.
important it has been for his formation.
Yeah, absolutely. And he did carry that for the rest of his life. He had to have a huge sense of pride in himself. And he was very dark-skinned. Martinique suffers from pigmentocracy. The lighter skinned you are, the more that you're considered to be, is considered to be a marker of success. Even when I was born, my grandmother, my Martinican grandmother said, oh, elle a peau sauvée, she has saved skin. So for my grandfather, who was very dark, he received a lot of racism in Martinique, and so it's a very difficult milieu, to live in. And he actually said when he moved to Paris, he felt better as a black man in his skin, even in a more white environment. That said, La Rue Cazenègre, Black Shack Alley, people were not writing about the everyday lives of people in Martinique. So this is a really radical book in that sense. It's a window into a world that wasn't considered worthy of fiction.
Hmm.
And I think that's the beauty of that, and it really captured people's imaginations. And then when it was turned into a film by Uzan Palsi in the 80s, she was Martinique, a young Martinican woman herself. She came to Joseph. She said she wanted to make a film, and she really understood what that cultural background, the love of the people, the community, the village, how people sustain one another. Um, and she captures all that, I think, beautifully in the film as well. And that's when the story really gained sort of more international traction. And then obviously the Penguin Classic publication in 2020, which I wish my grandfather was alive to see, because he'd have been so proud to have come from that kind of background and to be
Right.
published as a Penguin Classic writer.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a moment in the book when I think it's in Fort-de-France. He's at school, and he begins to love reading, right, and love
Mm.
literature, and but then he recognizes that the portrayals in the books that he's reading, that he does love, that his life is not portrayed, or that he says, I think, that there's no word for what his grandmother does, for example, maman dit.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And so he sets about I mean, so this book, I read it as partly he's setting about this project of how to, as you were saying too, how to represent or how to include that setting, that content,
Mhm.
within a literary framework.
He also is reading Black American books. In a novel, there's a reference to reading books by Black American authors, which are, I suppose, doing the work of educating him and really nurturing that sense of Black consciousness that Monsieur Medouse started. But yeah, he doesn't see himself in many of the books, and he also comments in the cinema and the representations in the cinema when he goes to the
Right.
cinema of the racist prejudice representations there, and even the woman who works in the cinema who sort of obsesses about being lighter skinned.
You mentioned earlier, right at the beginning, the term negritude. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe you could say a little bit more about that, and maybe place Zobel within. I mean, Martinique is I've never been, but it's amazing for a very small place. It has a number of writers and intellectuals, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, as well as Joseph Zobel, who come from there and kind of articulate a sense of cultural, racial politics. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes, so it was actually Aimé Césaire who really encouraged Joseph to write. So they were friends, and he actually called him one of the best writers in the Caribbean, which he was very proud about. So as you will know, it's an ideological literary movement, which really starts in the 1930s. And it's influenced by Harlem, by the Negro Renaissance writers and intellectuals. And the three fathers of negritude are really Aimé Césaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, who is the president of Senegal, and Léon Gontran Damas, who's a French Guyanese poet. So the idea was about rejecting the domination of the West, really encouraging this return to African traditions, to a celebration of African roots and African history, and a sense of Black pride, but also the recognition of the collective colonial experiences of Black people. So Joseph could be described as a negritude writer, and the scholar Louise Hardwick has described him as such, although some people have said that his writing is not so overtly political. But he did actually say, he did actually write, I do not feel that my negritude is a uniform or a function to which I must sacrifice my individuality. But I think that you'd agree, when we think of the, very much the ending of the story, it is to those who are blind and those who block their ears that I must cry out this story. Zobel is really doing the work of instilling a sense of Black pride in Martinicans, and the whole novel is a challenge to the colonial regime, to the Beckett, to the white master class, who are still keeping the people of Martinique very much in the conditions, not enslavement, but showing that things haven't changed, things haven't moved on, that they own all the land. And John, in Martinique, it's there's still the former families of the Beckets still own huge swathes of the island. It's still not, in a sense, an independent island, and the center of power is in France. So there's a lot to unpick there.
So the notion is, again, you were saying earlier on, or in talking about Medusa's version of history, these legal formal changes don't necessarily entail material changes, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm interested in, maybe this is, we're coming towards the end of our time.
Hmm.
I'm interested in the material actually in this book. So again, the protagonist, the narrator, as you say, is he's a star student, a star scholar. He has to learn whole new language as well. There's this the politics of language is interesting. It moves from Creole, or I think in the book it occasionally calls it patois, to
Hmm.
learning formal
Hmm.
French, reading literature and so on. But he recognizes, well, on the one hand, there's a passage towards the end where he talks about Mamantine's, his grandmother's body, and the way in which the work that she's done, and partly the sacrifice that she makes for him, is literally written on her body. And there's also a few passages which always fascinate me, in which he describes, for instance, the stevedores at the dock, at the sort of young black men and their physical prowess, I suppose.
Hmm.
I don't know if that also catches your eye.
Yes, well, the is I've actually, because I'm a poet, and I've written a few poems about Joseph, and there's a poem that I've written which responds to that description of Montine's hands at the end, and how each hand, has this indelible mud inscribed on it, and really the sort of the way that as she's passed away, and he's looking at her and thinking about how those hands have raised him and nurtured him and cared for him, and yet it's those hands that had to cut the sugar cane, and inscribed on them are all the pain and suffering of that lifestyle. There's a really beautiful passage, and I think he does bodies very well, and he's very acutely aware of the body, and in La Fête à Paris and his other writings as well. There's a really celebration of the body throughout, and I thought that does give it that strong kind of material sense. Really grounds it.
Yeah, this a moment again towards the end, I think, of the book, where he goes to a park, I think, and he watches everyone. He's a great observer,
Yes.
and describer of what he sees, and he watches the people promenading, and then goes down to talk and watches he's looking and registering, um, these sort of signs of the of social differentiation, I suppose. Um, in the course that I teach on this, we don't actually cover the film, but maybe you could say a little bit more about the film. It was, what's the title? It's Sugarcane Alley, right? Is the title that came out under a version. Maybe you could say a little bit about the translation or the transmutation from the literary, from the verbal to the image.
Yes, so it came out in 1983, and Uzan Palisi was one of the who's very celebrated director now. She was only in her 20s when she approached Joseph saying she wanted to make it into a film. Um, and she had there's some very well-known actors in the film, but there's also some local actors as well. And it really carries a lot, I think. It carries the core message of the book. Uh, there are moments which are perhaps even more radical, which are more fierce in its critique of colonialism, I think, in the film. Um, and it was immensely popular. It's shot in a kind of sepia, especially at the beginning. So there is this sense that it's a sort of postcard from another world. But it opened with this incredible scene of the breaking of the bowl, and being told off by Montine, and you get and then the children get drunk on rum and start burning the houses. And I will show it to my students, and I think it's absolutely impossible not to be completely drawn in at that scene. Actually, Joseph appears in it himself. He's the priest who's given in the church, who's very proud of being a natural part of the film. Um, but it's beautifully done, and I think that Uzan was very, very careful to make sure that it didn't lose its more radical message of colonial critique, and to keep that at its core, and not make it a Bildungsroman, make it a film about the young José growing up, but to keep the everyday life of the black people in Black Shack Alley and at its absolute core. So not a romanticization of that lifestyle, to show it in all its harsh reality.
And then back to the notion this is a book that demands or seeks a response. The film is, no doubt in some ways, a response to that call, right? And that
Yes.
continues many years after the book was written.
Yeah, I absolutely. And it's interesting because when Joseph was alive, Martinique didn't, well, he was celebrated, but often it takes for a writer to die, unfortunately, for a country to really realize the importance of that writer. And so since he's passed, there's been the year of Joseph Zobel, in 2015. It was 100 years since he was born. There's roundabouts named after him. There's statues of him. There's schools named after him. He's taught in schools. So the book, the scope of the book has grown and grown and become more and more international. And the Penguin Classics translation obviously really marks that as well. So it's wonderful to see, and I only wish he was here to see how much of an impact that it's had, and people are less and less people can block their ears to that reality.
That seems a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Emily, Professor Zobel Marshall, for this conversation.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.